Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. And yeah, you guys sent in some really interesting stuff this week, and we found something particularly fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's this article, right, from March 2025, and
Yeah.
looking back, it's kind of wild to think about it now, but it dives into Spotify's acquisition of Megaphone back in 2020.
Wow, 20?
20, I know, right? Ancient history, practically. But this piece, it's from Cognitive Market Research, and it really tries to get to the bottom of why Spotify, the music streaming giant, why they would shell out a whopping $235 million for, of all things, a podcast advertising platform.
Yeah, you don't often see those two worlds colliding that directly.
Exactly. So that's kind of our mission today, to really get inside Spotify's head, figure out what they saw in Megaphone, what Megaphone even brought to the table, and what this whole deal tells us about the future of podcasting and podcast advertising. Where's it all heading?
I think that's a great goal. It's fascinating to look back at a move like this, especially with a bit of hindsight, The whole podcasting landscape has changed so much, even into just the last few years. But looking at the reasons behind this acquisition, it's still really insightful, I think. What was Spotify really aiming for? What specific advantages did Megaphone offer? And, stepping back even further, what bigger lessons can we learn about how the whole audio space is evolving?
Totally. So let's break this thing down. Okay, so Spotify, right from the beginning, they made it pretty clear they weren't satisfied with just being the music hub. They wanted to be the platform for everything audio, podcasts especially.
Oh, yeah.
And not even just hosting all the podcasts out there. They wanted to completely change the way advertising worked in the podcasting world.
Right, right. And, if you look at what they were doing even before the Megaphone deal, it's clear they were on this podcasting buying spree. Remember all those acquisitions? Gimlet Media, Anchor, Parcast, all these content creators and production houses just scooping them up.
It's like they were stocking the shelves, getting ready for something big.
Yeah, they were building this massive library of content, laying the groundwork.
Exactly. So they've got the content right.
Mm.
But then the big question, how do you actually turn that content into, a real business? And that's where the whole challenge of making money from podcasts, that's where it gets interesting.
For sure. Because before Megaphone, the typical way podcasts made money from ads was through these things called baked-in ads, basically ads that were recorded directly into the episode itself,
Yeah, like part of the show.
Part of the show. And while that worked okay, it wasn't very flexible. You couldn't target specific listeners with different ads or easily switch them out later on.
And that's where Megaphone comes in with their tech, right?
Yeah.
Dynamic ad insertion, or DAI as the cool kids call it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you break that down for us? What exactly is DAI, and why was it such a game changer?
So what's really cool about DAI is the level of personalization it unlocks. Instead of everyone hearing the same ad baked into an episode, DAI lets you insert ads in real time as someone's listening.
So it's happening on the fly.
Exactly, on the fly. And technically what's happening is Megaphone's ad server technology is getting integrated into the whole podcast listening experience. So it can make these real-time calls for ad content based on the listener.
Okay, so it's using data about the listener to pick the ads.
Yeah, things like demographics, listening habits, even their general location. It's wild. And this fundamental shift from baked in to dynamic ads, it wasn't just about the technology. It was a strategic move to really unlock the scalability and addressability that would define the next era of audio advertising. I mean, think about it.
Yeah, it makes the ads way more relevant, right? So instead of me always hearing the same ad for, I don't know, gardening supplies, even though I live in an apartment,
Right.
I'm going to get an ad for running shoes if Spotify's data knows that's more my thing.
Yeah, exactly. And that relevance, it's not just good for the listener, it's key for advertisers too. But hold on, there's more. The advantages of Megaphone weren't just for the listeners and the big brands. It actually had a pretty big impact on the little guys, the independent podcast creators.
Oh, yeah, the indie creators.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. How did Megaphone help them make more money?
Okay, so before Megaphone, a lot of independent podcasters relied heavily on direct sponsorships. Getting a company to sponsor their show.
Yeah.
But that can be really time-consuming and tough to manage, especially to do it consistently.
You're hustling all the time.
All the time. But what Megaphone did was it gave these creators access to Spotify's giant advertising network, so even smaller niche shows could tap into a much wider pool of advertisers. That meant they could generate revenue more reliably without depending solely on those one-off sponsorship deals. It basically gave them a pathway to a more sustainable income.
So it's like Spotify wasn't just trying to control the ad market for their big-name podcasts. They were building a system that could help more creators actually make a living doing what they love.
Right.
And that's going to be a pretty powerful way to attract more content to your platform.
For sure. And we can't forget about the advertisers themselves. You touched on it earlier.
Yeah.
The power to target ads dynamically based on real-time listener data. And you combine that with Spotify's huge user base, their algorithms that already know what music people like. Suddenly you've got this incredibly powerful advertising tool.
That's true. But weren't advertisers already able to target audiences through other, digital channels? What made Spotify with Megaphone so special?
That's a great question. And the answer is Spotify already had this huge data set on people's audio habits. They knew what kind of music people listened to, when they listened, for how long. And combining that with Megaphone's ad tech, it was like,
Magic.
kind of. It meant advertisers could reach super specific groups within the podcast audience, a level of precision that other platforms just didn't offer back then.
Oh, that's interesting.
You could target people based on their actual listening tastes, not just some broad demographics.
Got it. And this obviously made the ads more effective. And when ads are more effective, advertisers are happier, right? So Spotify had a real edge in the digital audio advertising space.
100%. And the article really emphasizes this. Spotify didn't just stumble into this acquisition. It was a data-driven decision based on serious market research. They saw the trends and they knew this was the right move.
So what were some of those trends? What were the signs that acquiring Megaphone was a smart play?
Well, for one, podcasting was booming. The article cites Edison Research, and their 2020 report said there were over 100 million monthly podcast listeners in the U.S. alone. 100 million.
That's huge.
Huge. And that was 4 years ago. Imagine how much bigger that number is now. So the potential audience for advertisers was absolutely massive.
Yeah, no kidding. And the article also talks about this shift towards digital audio advertising. Traditional media, like radio and TV, they were declining. And advertisers were realizing that podcast listeners, they're engaged, they're loyal, they were the perfect target audience.
Exactly. So you've got the listeners, you've got the advertisers who are starting to pay attention. But advertisers, they want more than just a big audience. They want to know their ads are working, right? They want proof.
Of course, yeah. They need to see results.
And that's where the demand for data-driven advertising solutions comes in. Advertisers wanted insights, analytics, the ability to actually measure the impact of their campaigns. And Megaphone, with its real-time data on listeners, that was a huge draw for Spotify.
Makes sense. You can't just throw money at advertising anymore. You got to be smart about it.
Right. And I think what's really interesting here is Spotify, they were thinking long-term. They saw that podcasting wasn't just a fad, it was the future of audio. And with Megaphone, they had the tools to really capitalize on that future.
It sounds like Megaphone provided the missing piece, right? That sophisticated ad engine that Spotify needed to really make the most of their podcast content and their listeners.
That's a perfect way to put it. And if we zoom out a little bit, remember, the article also talks about how competitive the podcast market was becoming. Apple, Amazon, Google, they were all making their own moves.
Oh yeah, the big players were circling.
Right. So Spotify's acquisition of Megaphone wasn't just about improving their own platform. It was a strategic move to set themselves apart in a crowded field.
It's like Apple already had podcasts built into their iPhones and everything.
Right. A huge advantage.
And Amazon had Audible. Google was integrating podcasts into search results. So Spotify needed a way to stand out. And focusing on a more advanced advertising model, maybe that was their way to not just compete, but to offer something better to both creators and advertisers.
Exactly. While everyone else was focused on content or distribution, Spotify went all in on monetization. That was their differentiator.
Smart. So once they had Megaphone, how did Spotify actually integrate all that technology? It couldn't have been just plug and play.
Right. Oh, definitely not. The article talks about a few key areas where they focused their integration efforts. One big one was expanding something called streaming ad insertion, or SAI. That was Spotify's existing tech for inserting ads into streaming audio.
Okay.
And Megaphone's technology, it basically supercharged SAI, allowing for much more precise ad placements and a smoother listening experience. It's all about making the ads less disruptive and more relevant to the listener.
Yeah, nobody wants to be bombarded with irrelevant ads when they're in the middle of a podcast.
For sure. Another key thing they did was open up the Spotify Audience Network, SPAN, to Megaphone's publisher partners. This basically meant that more podcasters, even those not directly on Spotify, could tap into Spotify's advertising network.
So a wider reach for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. More ways for creators to earn money, a bigger audience for advertisers, all within the Spotify world.
Sounds like a win-win.
Right. And the last piece of the integration puzzle was data. Spotify really beefed up their analytics and measurement tools, using Megaphone's expertise to give both advertisers and podcasters much deeper insights into listener behavior.
So things like how long people listen,
Yeah.
which ads they engage with, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and even more granular stuff like what devices people are using, demographics, all that. This data was super valuable for both creators and advertisers to understand what's working and what's not.
Yeah, data is king.
It really is. But, even with all these advancements, the article doesn't shy away from the challenges and, like, the bigger questions that this whole thing raised.
Right, because it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it? What were some of the obstacles they ran into?
Well, for one, competition remained fierce. Apple and Google, they weren't just sitting back and watching. Apple launched their own subscription model for podcasts, and Google was busy weaving podcasts into their massive search engine.
So the pressure was on for Spotify to keep innovating.
Absolutely. It's a constant race in the tech world. And then there was the whole issue of privacy. Data privacy regulations were getting stricter, things like GDPR in Europe and Apple's app tracking transparency.
Oh yeah, those were big changes.
Huge. And it made things tricky for Spotify because, targeted advertising relies on data. So they had to find ways to comply with these new rules while still delivering effective advertising.
Not an easy task.
Yeah.
You want to personalize the ads, but you also have to respect people's privacy. It's a delicate balance.
Very delicate. And then on top of all that, there's the challenge of balancing user experience with monetization. You need ads to make money, but too many ads or annoying ads, they can drive listeners away.
Yeah, you don't want to ruin the listening experience.
Right. So Spotify had to find that sweet spot where they could generate revenue without overwhelming their audience.
And they're still working on that, right? It's an ongoing challenge.
Absolutely. Now, the article also gives us a glimpse into what Spotify's planning for the future. What's next for them in the podcasting world?
I'm curious to hear that. What's coming down the pipeline?
Well, one thing they're focusing on is expanding podcast monetization tools, going beyond just dynamic ad insertion and exploring new ways for creators to make money.
So thinking outside the traditional ad model.
Yeah. They're looking at things like premium subscriptions where listeners pay for ad-free listening or exclusive content. And they're working on more sophisticated ad revenue sharing programs to attract and retain top podcasters.
Makes sense. Give creators more options, more ways to earn a living.
Right. Another big area of focus is using AI to make ad targeting even more personalized and effective.
So taking it to the next level.
Exactly. They're leveraging all that data they have on listeners to tailor the ads in a way that feels less like an interruption and more like, something you might actually be interested in.
That's the dream, right? Ads that are actually useful.
The holy grail. And of course, they're going to keep investing in exclusive and original content. That's a big part of what draws people to Spotify in the first place. They want those must-listen shows that you can't find anywhere else.
Yeah, exclusive content is a big draw these days.
It is. And finally, Spotify's also looking to expand globally. They want to reach new audiences all over the world by localizing content and ad solutions.
So taking podcasting global.
Exactly. There's a huge potential audience out there, and Spotify wants to be the platform that connects them with the content they love.
It's ambitious, for sure. So taking a step back and looking at the big picture, it seems pretty clear that Spotify's decision to acquire Megaphone back in 2020, that was a major turning point. It wasn't just about buying a company. It was a strategic bet on the future of podcasting and advertising.
It really was. They saw the potential of podcasting, and they knew that Megaphone was the key to unlocking that potential.
And in a way, it benefited everyone. Podcasters got more ways to make money, advertisers got better targeting and results, and Spotify solidified its position as a leader in the audio world.
Right. It created this whole ecosystem where everyone could thrive.
It really makes you think, Spotify's moves in podcasting and advertising. I mean, how is this going to shape how we listen to audio and how creators make a living in the years to come? It's fascinating to think about.
It's mind-blowing, honestly. And as the technology gets even more sophisticated, as the ads get more personalized, I think it also raises some big questions for us as listeners. Like, what are the implications of all this targeting? What does it mean for our privacy, for our listening experience? It's definitely something we need to keep thinking about as the audio landscape keeps evolving.
Lots to ponder. Well, on that note, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world of audio.